Hello and welcome to Governance in Crisis. I'm Hil Sewell.
And I'm Peter Lynas. And we are going to be looking at how we offer practical support to leaders and how we help them to develop, but also how we hold them accountable when that's necessary. So we're going to look at a couple of different questions together today, Hil. We're going to look at who decides. These are the kind of governance questions that I enjoy. We're going to look at the what they get to decide, things like employment and HR, which is much more your ballpark. And then how we do that, a culture around management, around training, and around development. So why are we having this conversation? Why are you in this conversation?
Well, as Director of People and Culture here at the EA, I get asked these things all the time. How do you do this? How do you manage people well? How do you keep people motivated? How do they perform well in their roles? All sorts of questions that need answering and need stuff in place to be able to answer those questions.
Yeah, and as a repentant lawyer, I get asked lots about governance because I actually like that. And then as somebody in leadership, we get asked again, both of us get asked a lot. And we as an organization, how do we work with leaders? How do we support them? How do we put the systems in place around that and the culture and the values that are necessary to go with that? So we're going to work through those three questions, which starts with who?
Yeah, who decides, Peter?
I think that is the big question. I think clarity is kindness on this. We've said that a lot. I think we need to be clear who gets to decide in a situation. And leaders like to make decisions often, but there's often a trustee board. There might be a parish council. You can have an executive committee. You can have all sorts of advisory groups, councils around a situation. So one of the biggest questions when somebody comes to me, I'm like, well, who gets to decide in your current organization? Do you know? Is it you as the leader? Is it a leadership team? Is it your board? And good governance is really key on this. And one of the biggest questions is around boards. People are at like, who's on your board? How often do they meet?
Yeah.
Do they know what their powers are? Have they been trained? Do they have any sense of understanding? We've seen that with some of the stuff that's come up for us. You've too many employees on a board. You've too many mates on a board. You don't have enough support or friends on a board. You don't have people who understand. You don't have the right skill set. Or you have everybody who's really finance orientated or everybody who's really church orientated. So getting the right group of people on your board is one of the first things I like to talk to people about when we're looking at this kind of thing. And that changes for an organization. So it probably looks really different for us that it's going to look for a one-person organization. I mean, we have quite a lot of systems in place that you are responsible for, thankfully, and not me.
Yeah, and then we'd be talking employees now, but when an organization has a number of employees, there must be systems and processes in place. So we must start with contracts of employment, job descriptions. People need to know where they stand. We need to define these things.
And the context and the size matters. So we're an organization of, say, 40 staff.
Yeah, plus, yeah.
Yeah, that kind of size. We have quite a big trustee board. In fact, one of the reasons we're here is the trustees are meeting soon. So we're over for a meeting around that. So that's a group of maybe a dozen people in our organization. We have quite a lot of manuals and processes in place. But if you're a smaller church, you might just have a pastor as your sole employee, possibly even a part-time employee. Often they'll have a caretaker, perhaps a church secretary part-time, but it'll be a pretty small group of people. And often the people who are serving as trustees or leaders are going to be church members, people involved. And so they might have very different, you're not likely to have loads of policies in place in that moment.
Absolutely not. But those people, however few they are, need to know the rules.
Yeah, you still got to get that basic question, who decides?
Yeah,
and you've
absolutely.
got to have the clarity around that. And that for us comes like things like safeguarding are really important. Do you have your safeguarding officer? Do you have clarity as to where that goes? But it also comes to what might seem quite small things, but what happens if you go off and talk in another church? What happens to that honorarium, that money? Where does it go?
Yeah.
Who pays the expenses in that moment? Holidays, pay, sick pay. I mean, that's a classic one when somebody goes off in a smaller church. You have a policy. It says you get a couple of weeks, but it's your pastor. You're like, oh, what do we do? Do they go to half pay? Does that seem fair? Sometimes, I think in my experience, I prefer to have the policy and then move away from it than have nothing and everybody's kind of presuming, oh, but I thought you'd all pay me.
Yeah.
And it seems really harsh if you don't, or vice versa. You say, oh, surely we drop that. So what you do with speaking fees, what you do with sick pay, lots of those things.
All of those things need to be clear and written down. So even if it's just a principles document, but typically we'd come back to some policies and say, this is our policy on sick pay. This is our policy around annual leave. And they may just be what appear as a set of guidance notes, but there needs to be something that's written down that we can refer back to. And as you said earlier, in an organisation of our size, that will be a suite of policies that make up a staff handbook.
Yes.
But it needn't be that comprehensive. But
Yeah.
there needs to be a note in each of those areas. People need to know where they stand. We don't want to be thinking these things up after something has come up. Oh, how are we going to address this? It should have been written down in
It's really hard
advance.
because it gets very personal at that moment.
Yeah,
It's very much
yeah.
a response to the person. Whereas, so we're, as a mid-sized organization, we're going to have a governance manual, we'll have trustee manuals, we'll have employee handbooks, and we'll have quite a lot of policies around that.
Yeah.
But even if you're smaller, the place to start, because that can sound overwhelming, certainly when I'm chatting to people, the place I would say is just sit down and have a meeting for an hour, which
Yeah.
you carve an hour and say, who's deciding some of this stuff? Who do
Yeah.
we think's in charge of that piece of decision making? And suddenly you go, oh, we all think we are, or
Yeah.
we think nobody is. Okay, that's our first port of call, is just to identify a few of those things.
Absolutely. So you'll have a list of options, identified areas, and a name allocated to each of those. And in that way, you should have most of the basics covered. Things may come up that are not on your list, but they're likely then to be linked to your basic list. So you will go back and have reference to a key individual.
And borrow from other people is the other thing. Like, now always I would want to contextualize it to where you are, but other people have thought about this. They map a policy. Speak to your friends who are in another organization, another church. Say, do you have anything on?
Yeah.
Oh, that's really helpful. This is what you do with speaking fees or with expenses or whatever it is. That's really useful to know. Or sabbaticals is another classic
Yeah.
one. In a church context, do you have them? What's fair? What's appropriate? Or study support, study leave. So denominations and sort of larger networks are a bit better. They've thought that through often on a kind of organization or network-wide level. It's individual churches often go, oh, our pastor's been here 7 years, seems fair. They want to go on some study leave. We've got nothing written down. So go and chat to your guys in the more of the denomination and say, what's your standard policy around that? And that can be really helpful.
Good conversation, good communication, really helpful, but be careful. Word of warning, one size doesn't fit all.
Yes.
So what you want to do in your organization is going to be very much linked to your values and your culture and essentially the size of your organization. So you're not going to borrow something from a mega organization that will fit your two-person.
So many churches actually prefer to meet with churches of a similar size, even from a radically different kind of theological or stream, because they're facing similar challenges
Issues.
than just meeting with everybody in their stream. That's important in a different way.
Yeah.
But a church with a staff team of 20 is very different than a staff team of one or even a half person.
And the interactions and how those things work out will be different based on the size.
Absolutely. So, okay. So who decides is a critical question. Clarity is kindness on that, as in the more you can bring clarity and be clear on that, it's actually in the long term a real saving, even though at the time it might feel a bit awkward to wrestle it through. What sort of things do people have? Let's look at the what now, the kind of rules and policies.
Yeah. So this is going back to what I alluded to earlier. We need to start where we're employing people with a contract of employment and a clear job description. People need to know the boundaries of their role, what's expected of them, and how they're going to work that out on a day-to-day basis. So those are the sort of things that will tend to be written in a job spec, a job description, whatever you like to call it. There should normally be some sort of person specification that sits alongside that. So it talks about the knowledge and skills, the experience that's required to undertake that role. So we need to be sure right up front, right at the start when we're employing someone, do they actually have the skills, the knowledge and experience to undertake this role? Let's not set someone up to fail from the get-go.
And it sounds so obvious, but actually people often don't do it because they've already got somebody in mind they want to employ, or they've just borrowed it from somewhere else and it's kind of, it's close enough, we'll just do that. And I mean, you literally need to work through, what do we actually want in this job? What does it actually need to do? What sort of person do we actually want? And write those things down.
And you make a really good point there around order, because we want to define the role. And then we look to, well, what actually are the skills and the experience that we need to undertake this role? So we're not defining the person that we want in place here. We're defining the role, and then we look for a person, the right person to fill that role. But we need to do these things.
And it's fair to say you do make us do this, because we have sometimes, I'll confess it's me, I'm like, oh, we need to employ this person and we need somebody to do this. And you're like, hold on, what is it they actually need to do?
Yeah.
What does the job actually entail? How many hours does that take? And even where we might ban that in an organization that goes, oh, where does that sit within our structure? At what level do we want to employ? Rather than me going, hey, it'd be great to have this person doing this. So policies are actually your friend, I think, and actually somebody pushing back and saying, just pause now and get this bit right, is worth the effort. And you do make us really work hard at job descriptions,
Yeah.
which I think
And
helps.
and that's more important in an organization of our size, the kind of 40 plus, because the relativities need to be right. So we need to be looking at job size and structure and where does this role fit within the organization. That obviously won't be the case in a much smaller church or organization, but it's still important that we define the role, even if it's sitting in isolation or even if it's only in a 2-person team. But the importance grows with the size of the organization.
It does. So you've set out in the job descriptions, but the job description what you need the person to do. Often there'll be a person spec, say, do you need certain level of experience or
Yep.
qualifications or some particular sets of background around that. And one of the other big discussions often pay, like, so there are various metrics out there. I mean, certainly I know in my own church context, we've often used there's a voluntary services have a kind of pay scale that you
Yep.
can at least begin to do some banding, or some people use teaching scales, trying to get bands, get this right for people. Because again, pay can be a classic one where you're inadvertently paying people radically different, not just amounts, but essentially rates and scales, because you've come at it from 2 different lenses. In a small organization, you've got 3 staff, but they're being paid on very different understandings of where the pay band should be. So, I mean, it's one of your areas of expertise.
Yeah, and that's where it's really important that we know who our comparator group is. So who are we comparing with? So here at the EA, obviously, we are a charity. We're a faith-based charity, so we can compare with other similar organizations. If you're a church, you may want to share with others, compare with other similar churches. How you get hold of that information might be quite difficult. So just some warnings there. Don't always look to adverts, because there's likely to be some premium on a job advert, but you do need to understand who you're comparing with, where you want to pitch your salary scales and your salary levels, so that you are able to attract and retain the right staff. And that will transfer into what we would loosely call a set of salary scales. And so people are pitched at a right level.
Yeah.
across
So I
the
know
organisation.
I'm going to guess some people listening are kind of like, oh, these guys are real rules and policies orientated. But we genuinely think that in many of these matters, getting this stuff right is going to be your friend. The more clarity you have, again, around sickness, around expenses, around sabbaticals, around trainings, around work from home, another classic one.
Yeah.
Like, again, we have a policy. We're really clear what that is. We say that to people. So again, it's not ad hoc. It's not just when somebody comes along, we're like, oh, yeah, that's fine. Or somebody so-and-so seems to be working from home loads. We're like, here's what we expect.
Yep.
Here's our understanding. And we bring some clarity to that. And that also applies in reviews and appraisals. We're actually in that season right now. And you tell me lots of things I'm supposed to do. So talks a little bit more about what we do in the review and appraisal season.
Yeah, this is a really positive time of year from my perspective. So we have established our roles, we have our contracts of employment that will refer to a number of our policies, and one of those will be our appraisal and performance management system. And basically, what we're saying there is there are a number of key responsibilities in your job description, number of key objectives. How are we monitoring how you're doing against those? So each year we will sit down with our staff and say, how's the last year gone? How have you done against those objectives that we set? And now looking ahead to the next year, what's the bigger picture look like? Where's our strategic plan taking us over this next year? How are the objectives of your job description matching in with that? And then how individually are you going to work that out in the day-to-day responsibilities of your role? So I'd be asking each line manager, when they're going through this review process, to be looking at some overarching objectives. Let's make sure they're matching into the strategic plan. Then some more specific objectives, looking at the departmental area, how that team might be working towards that overall plan, and then honing right down into, okay, how is you as an individual? How are you doing against those objectives? What are your development needs for the next year? It's all very well to say, this is our expectation of you in your role within this team, but actually, do you have the skills? Do you have what you need in terms of resources to be able to meet those objectives? And again, going back to something I said earlier, we do not want to be setting people up to fail. We want to set them up to thrive. And if
So I think that's critical for me. Is like we want them to thrive,
Mm.
but also we also want to catch per performance if it's happening earlier. Because one of the things that we read consistently in some of the reviews for challenges and issues that have faced the church is the flags were there. This could have been spotted earlier.
Yeah.
If people had taken action earlier, maybe things would have been different. If people are engaged, so we want to catch. We absolutely want to build a platform to allow people to flourish and to thrive. But we also want to catch any per performance issues. So we do have 3 or 4 other staff members feeding back in as part of that review. The line manager engages and says, did you meet your objectives? We want to check that people are still in line with our basis of faith. They still believe what we believe, but also very importantly for us, our ethos statement, which is something we brought in the last few years, which is to ask some basic questions that often weren't being asked in a Christian organization. Do you read the Bible? Do you go to church? Do you pray?
Yep.
Do you share about your belief and faith in Jesus with other people, as well as some issues that are important, we think, in the cultural moment that we're in around what marriage is between a man and a woman, our understanding of male and female, the importance of justice, the importance of creation care. So we have a short statement, 10, I think, maybe 9 things in it. I should know the number. And every year in our appraisal, so not only when you're being recruited do we say, hey, do you agree with our basis of faith, our kind of statements of belief? We also ask about our ethos. Are you on board with that? But then every year in appraisals, we check, hey, is there anything that you're uncomfortable with, any reason you can't agree with that, and make sure people are on board, because we want to check if there's going to be an issue. So we're catching problems in advance. For me, at least, as the line manager of a number of stuff, that's one of the biggest things. And I really, while the appraisal process does take time, and you make sure you push us hard, Hil, to make sure we're working hard on it, actually, I find it a really encouraging time of year. So it's a big part of what are the rules, if you like, what do we do to make sure staff can be supported and thrive?
And to add to that, the ethos statement, the fact that it's there and defined, gives us permission to ask all those questions that you just referred to. So they're not random questions that a line manager thinks, oh, I'm just going to check in on their church attendance. They are related to a very specific statement that is important for us as an organisation.
And we're going to flag some resources of how you can see that. That statement's public from us at the Evangelical Alliance. Like, we're very clear about that. We're happy to tell people more about that. But we're also saying, we went on a journey, took our staff team through it as to how we built that in. We made sure people were on board. They understood why it was important. So again, it's not just a kind of secret document or something we dropped in from nowhere. We want staff to get on board with it. We teach around it. We engage around it. You do a lot of training and development. Part of it is around these things. We're going to come to that. So we've got what are the issues, if you like, in the positive sense. We've got the proactive stuff that we do in training and development and support. And then sometimes we do have a problem. Which probably comes more into my court when we get challenging situations that we've had.
So what happens when there is a problem? What sense does any of this stuff make?
So I think we have external organizations come to us and ask us, because obviously we don't have any problems, of course. No, we have people coming in. And again, our biggest question is clarity. What is the problem you're actually faced with? So we can look back and talk about some of the things we've said. Hey, you should have done it, would have been good. But what's the problem right now? So it might be an HR problem, your area of expertise. So we're saying, actually, that's an employment problem. The person's in breach of contract. It's not actually to do with legals or safeguarding. This is really about their employment. They're simply not doing the job at some level. And therefore, you may need HR support. So it's people we would recommend or go to around that in terms of that saying, right, that's an HR issue. It might be in some of the situations that we've been involved in, and some of the ones that are more in the press, around a safeguarding issue. So, in one sense, there's clarity there. You kind of know, but there's two. You've got child safeguarding issues there. You've got a clear line. You've got who you should be going to. There may be something relating to a vulnerable adult. And again, there's people we would say, great, at that point, we think you should go to 31A or somebody else who's that their expertise is in that space, whether it's to run a review process, whether it's to get advice. And there are some of those kind of flow charts that can really help you work through that once you've identified that that's the issue. One of the cautions is that there had been almost a tendency to put everything in that. There's almost like, well, let's just make it everything. So we've got to actually work through, well, what is it? What is it? Is it HR? Is it safeguarding? It might be it's more a kind of almost like a legals issue. Maybe somebody has done something either illegal, that might be external of going to the police and the charity commission, or it might just be you need more like a law firm, because it's more in that kind of bullying space, the coercion stuff that we've seen. It's not safeguarding as such, but it's some of the, so you can read the reports that have dealt with that. And there may be financials. It might be more to do with the financial irregularities. You might need an accountancy firm or somebody, or a bookkeeper, to come in and help you work through, has somebody be doing something with money that's inappropriate. And those are slightly different things. You don't go to the same person for all of those. So one of the first things we ask is, what's actually the problem? Because people go, there's a problem. What's the problem? Let's identify, and then we go back to who decides, Who's going to set that up? Because again, if it's in relation to your CEO or your lead pastor, that's really complicated if they're sitting on the board as well. So you might have to set up different groups and say somebody's got to work with the pastor or the CEO in this moment. So maybe one or two trustees
Yep.
are set aside to stay with them and kind of be like support them, because we don't want to presume anything. The rest of the trustees will then have to run a process and engage around this, run a review, maybe have external support, make sure that's sufficiently independent. You get into a lot of detail here, but it's not, these are difficult. It's worth saying these are draining situations.
Yep.
These are not easy to work through. We know that. But there are also people who've been harmed or hurt in these situations. And there's a good reason why we're running these. And so we need to hold all of those. And we need to be very aware of victims or those who have come forward. So again, we're talking about a whole scale of things. You may have a relatively simple HR right through to something more substantial, the things we've read about in the press. We've tried to navigate that through, and that's something we try and help our members just a little bit with as well. So those are heavy and bigger subjects. But again, it's something we want to try and help support people through, because we've understood a little bit about what's going on in that moment. Or you might get something much simpler, but succession planning. It's a great thing for boards to do. I come from a family business background. That was a big thing for us to work through. Actually, I've worked through with some organizations. The sooner you get on that, the easier it is, rather than the person's like, I'm about to quit now, what do we do? I'm about to step down. So again, every couple of years, the board should be looking, going, what happens if our CEO either leaves or our pastor retires? Have we got some, who decides next?
Yeah.
If it's a couple, like all sorts of questions. Yes, sir.
And that's all going to be linked back into development plans that we talked about earlier. Are they working? Do we have them? Are we regularly looking at them? So things like succession planning will flow out of that. But again, let's not look at each of these things in isolation. Someone's leaving, what should we do? We go back to that annual review. In there, we do have development plans. So all of these things are linked. And when we start to look at one thing in isolation, then that's where the issues are, I think.
So we've looked at who decides. We think that's absolutely critically important. We've looked at what kind of issues come up. Finally, how, which is really important. And some people, this is their preferred space. They want to talk culture. They want to talk values. And for some, it's like, once we've got the what, we're fine. So we have lots of conversations here about value and culture. Values shape the culture. We're big on that. Our ethos statement comes out of our values. It also helps shape our values. And we want to see emotionally healthy leadership. But we also mix that with structure. So you and I like to do a little bit of a dance on that. But you lead for us in culture and values. So how do we do that cultural input piece, and how do we hold the structure around that?
Yeah, just really important that there is understanding, that our staff team understand the culture of the organisation. How do they do that? Well, they need to know what our values are. So we need to be telling good stories about our values. We need to be talking about them all the time. One of our values is that we're prayerful. Well, what does it mean to be prayerful? How do we do that? What does it look like? Have you seen one of your colleagues living our values really well? So let's be talking about them. We talk about them in our annual review process as well.
We do.
How are we doing as an organisation in terms of living these values? Because we'll only ever be as good as an organisation as the individuals that make that organisation up. So it's about understanding and about talking about how we're living them.
Yeah, and you lead heavily on values. We have a lot of staff gatherings, lots as in weekly calls. You in particular lead and help us lead into that. And we gather our staff together a lot, and we work through values. We engage them, we teach about it, we train about it, we talk about it a lot. And I think for me, one of the takeaways there is both to have the values, and we kind of put we kind of press the accelerator pedal. People talk about that on those kind of cultural values a lot. We model them, we talk about them. But we have a structure, like you were saying in appraisals, that also feeds back on them and creates mechanisms around them to ensure they are caught. Values are caught. I totally get that culture is caught, but it's also taught, and it has to have a structure to support it. Otherwise, it will, I think, fall over in a lot of these places.
And we talked about this with the ethos statement. We are very clear about that at the point of advertisement for any vacancies. We certainly talk about it at interview. And that's where our conversation around our values will start. So even when we're interviewing someone, are they going to align? Are they going to be able to fit within this culture? What do we see already, even at this early stage?
Yeah, and we have that. We talk about that at our board as well. So it's with staff, it's with board, it's with our council. It drives all the way through every layer of the organisation. I think that's absolutely critical on that ethos statement in particular. Again, our board are on board, because the board are the ultimate decision makers in so many areas. And for a lot of people, they're the kind of finance, legal, or governance guys in the background who only come in at the last moment. But if that's the case, then you don't know what you're getting in a sense, and they don't really understand the org. So it's really important those things are aligned as best we can.
Yep.
The kind of executive who's day-to-day running whatever it is, the church, the organization, and the board who has governance and trustee responsibility. So I think hopefully that's helpful for people as we've had this conversation, and we've talked about that who question, who decides, the kind of governance question. We've talked about what is the issue, really trying to get in on that. Do you have policies? Do you have rules? We think, you'll not be surprised because I'm a repentant lawyer, that policies are your friend, but actually borrow, beg, and don't steal, but get them from other people and kind of build up your policy bank a little bit. Even if it's bullet points and some outline stuff, it's really helpful to have something written down so there is that kind of clarity again when people are coming along. And then how you roll this out is that classic combination of culture and structure. They talk about strategy, culture eats strategy for breakfast. But I also think the flip side of that, if you like, if you don't have a structure around your culture, it also gets crushed under weight. You've got to hold these two. Culture is a value and it's something that's caught, but we need a structure that supports and holds that together. So we're going to have lots of resources in the links below. Hopefully you will find that helpful as we kind of wrestle with governance in crisis, but particularly in this, how we develop, how we support, and how we hold our leaders accountable when that's necessary. Thanks.